Hey everyone, really good to be with you here today and talking about some of my favorite stuff. So, like Joseph just said, I've been in this field since 1987. Makes me really, really old. But most of my career, well, and it's starting to change just a little bit as I get a little older, but most of my career has been spent in substance abuse. And I have been in love with substance abuse treatment and particularly working with adolescents and young adults. And so I'm excited to be able to talk with you today and talk about some of the things that are unique to adolescents when we talk about substance abuse, when we talk about addiction. Um, and so I know that Joseph and Kristen are going to kind of monitor the chat section. If you have questions, please put them in there, and we will try and get to those at a couple of maybe natural spots in the presentation that give us a chance to maybe ask a couple of questions or answer a couple of questions, excuse me, and then we can. I will do my best to leave a few minutes at the end to be able to answer a few questions as well. So off we go. As he said, I been around a whole long time and really old. And but in being old, it makes me also a grandfather, which is my favorite thing in my life. I've found that I thought I had kids so that we could, have them mow the lawn and do the dishes and things like that. It turns out we had kids so we could have grandkids, and that has been just the most amazing thing. I will warn everyone, though, that raising adult children is much more difficult than raising children. Things change, a little less influential. You have to be careful about what you say. Um, and the choices they make much bigger with bigger consequences. There's a lot of big challenges that come when you're raising adult children. So, and it's a good thing they have kids. Uh, it makes it easier to be around them. So let's just start with understanding kind of the scene, the state of the union here. What are we dealing with? We're dealing with ever increasing statistics. We're seeing adolescents with increased use, alcohol, vaping, marijuana, prescription. As you can see the screen here, and I don't need to read it all to you. I thought one of the really interesting stats here was that over 10 years, vaping has increased from 2% to almost 30%. Alcohol continues to be a gateway drug, the most common used among adolescents, although marijuana is done a great job of catching up to that. But we are seeing some pretty high numbers. I'm a little, of course, a lot, not a little, a lot concerned about what we're seeing with opioid overdose deaths, but we're also seeing synthetic drugs like fentanyl that have come in and are really kind of changing the scene on us as well. So, um, alcohol and driving, we're seeing kids, and we'll talk about this a little bit because we see some different behaviors with kids when they're using than we have a tendency to see quite as much with adults, primarily because of the development of their brain, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Very, very scary is the binge drinking that's happening. We're seeing party drinking that's pretty scary. Um, one of the interesting trends that kind of comes and goes are things like alcohol enemas, where at frat parties and different get-togethers, they're introducing alcohol in the back end. And because of its direct access to your processing systems, it is extremely, extremely dangerous, resulting in quite a few alcohol overdose deaths. Um, we are seeing that typically Adolescents are beginning sometime between the ages of 11 and 14. But what we're seeing though is that those who start before the age of 14 are far more likely to experience substance use disorders later in life. The damage that is done to the brain in those early years while it is forming, and these toxic and corrosive chemicals are being introduced into that development. It's creating significant issues in the long run. But then here's the other statistic that I think is really important. And again, we're gonna talk a little bit more about this, but it's the impact that mental health has on substance abuse. As you can see there, around 40% of teens with substance use problems have co-occurring diagnoses, have co-occurring issues like depression, anxiety, ADHD. Um, these two go hand in hand. In fact, really, um, we talk a lot, particularly with adolescents, about drugs and alcohol aren't the problem. There's something else going on. Typically, an adolescent is self-medicating, and so we've got to be able to see what's kind of happening there. Um, the pandemic. So when we had to go through this, why I don't know, but it sure gave us a curveball. Mental health disorders increased by as much as 25% around the world, and not just around the world, but also globally, meaning around through multiple mental health issues. Not just anxiety, not just depression, but all kinds of mental health disorders cropped up and saw a significant increase during COVID-19 pandemic. Alcohol consumption increased significantly. Um, and again, so did binge drinking, which is interesting when they all felt like they kind of lost their freedom. They took to numbing pretty significantly. And increased marijuana use, nicotine, vaping increased 25% during the pandemic. Pretty significant. And then what we started to see was a sharp increase in adolescent overdoses. Over 50% increase was reported during the pandemic, particularly involving opioids and synthetic drugs like fentanyl. So I think, again, we're going to move on here to start talking about what's going on. But I think in order to really understand what's going on, we need to understand that we are with addiction, um, and you have to know. For me, I'm pretty reluctant to call an adolescent an addict. They'll abuse substances, they'll use substances, but to be addicted, and we'll talk about that again here in just a minute. But I do think we are dealing with the element of disease here, and so the definition, any deviation from basically regular functioning of any body part, organ, or system that manifests symptoms. And so if we really boil that down, a disease means we have an organ that has a defect that manifests symptoms. Well, in the case of addiction, we are dealing with the brain. That's the organ that has the defect, and it's interesting because, and again, we're gonna spend a little bit of time right here, right now, talking about the brain. Um, that that midbrain takes a starring role in addiction. It takes a starring role in a lot of what we're dealing with, just in terms of mental health. But the midbrain really is where addiction spends almost all of its time. We used to think that it was the prefrontal cortex, or that forebrain, which is responsible for logical thought and reasoning, rational, problem solving, those kinds of things. And the reason we thought that is because um, drug addicts, alcoholics, those people that are struggling with addiction have a tendency to show poor judgment, poor decision making. And so there was kind of this natural thought that, all right, well, that must mean then that uh, substances, any, these illicit drugs or alcohol are directly affecting the prefrontal cortex. And that's not true. It is actually impacting the midbrain, and we'll talk about that uh, right now as we understand this. Now, the hindbrain is responsible for survival. It's responsible for all the parts of our body that work without us having to think about it, that keep us alive, our heart, our lungs, our body temperature, all of those kinds of things. So it really is concerned only with survival. That midbrain is responsible for memory. It's responsible for emotion. But we have some key chemicals that function in that part of the midbrain, which brings us to the defect in the brain that helps us understand that this is a disease. The defect is a disorder of pleasure. So again, it occurs in the midbrain, not the frontal cortex. Um, it's a downregulation in dopamine. And let me explain to you what that means and why that happens. So if somebody uses, let's just say cocaine, somebody uses cocaine, well, their dopamine levels are going to increase to about 700% of normal, which is too high. The brain isn't happy with that. The brain shuts off the little dopamine producing factory so that that dopamine level can come down. And with drugs, it starts to come down after about 10 or 15 minutes is all. The half-life of the drugs are pretty short, and so after they wear off and the neurons are not being stimulated to fire neurochemical anymore, then that dopamine level starts to come down. And the problem, though, is that then as it comes down, because that little factory has shut off, the brain thinks you're dying. The brain, because your dopamine's too low, and it starts to think that you can't feel pleasure. And if you can't feel pleasure, that's because you're dying. And so then your hindbrain, responsible for survival, kicks in, shuts off your forebrain, which is responsible for uh, decision making and rational thought, and focuses right in on, I need more dopamine. And so, as you can see here, we've got a picture of four different brains: a normal brain of a cocaine user, the brain of an alcoholic, and the brain of an obese person. And I know you guys are seeing this immediately, um, but it's interesting. In the brain of the cocaine user and the brain of the alcoholic, there's the unique part in those brains is the dark spaces, which is actually inactive areas of the brain, which is due to toxic chemicals being ingested into the body and their impact on the brain. But what's really interesting here, and you'll notice that over time, um, they don't naturally or normally have appropriate levels of dopamine in their brain. But what's really interesting is that when we look at that brain of an obese person, we don't have those dark areas or dead areas. However, because of the process of satiation, which is basically sending chemicals into the brain, satiating our desire for pleasurable the pleasure that comes from eating something. If you think about it, it's kind of like um, well, with cocaine use. I listened to Dr. Daryl Inaba. He was the clinical director at the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic years and years ago, and he was at the University of Utah speaking, and he talked about cocaine being a presynaptic drug. So it attaches itself uh, prior to the synaptic gap, causes the neuron to fire the neurochemical, but then because of it's attaching itself to the neuron doesn't have the ability to reuptake the neurochemical over time. And so it depletes the neurochemical. And in this case, we're looking at that neurochemical being dopamine. He talked about, with most drugs, really the high is related to the neurochemical, not the drug itself. It's the drug causing our body to fire the normal natural chemicals that we already have, and that would he gave us some examples. Fear, so any kind of intense fear. You don't know. Well, in fact, he told the story of somebody on PCP coming into his office and picking up his oak desk and moving it to get to him. That was an intense fear that he experienced. Fright, which would be more sudden. Looking up from your radio while you're driving on the freeway, only to see everybody stopped in front of you. Those kinds of things. Fight, somebody, especially if you're having to fight for your life, maybe being mugged in New York and you're fighting for your life, you're going to experience these extremely elevated levels of dopamine, adrenaline, other chemicals, but you are going to experience um, higher levels of these chemicals. One of them that he talked about, though, is satiation, and that's both from eating and also sexual satiation. That those chemicals that fire during those activities are the same chemicals that fire when, say, cocaine is used. And so over time, though, that dopamine is depleted because the reuptake vents aren't working anymore. And so over time, that is just depleted. And that's what you're looking at here with these brains is that dopamine level is depleted over time. And it's interesting. So these slides come from Dr. Amen out of the Amen Clinic in California, and he specializes in brain stuff. Anyway, he gave this presentation, and my partner Arden was actually at that conference and listened to his presentation. And he stood up and he says, "I'm going to offend most of the people in this room. We as human beings are becoming dinosaurs. We're having great big bodies and little tiny brains." And this is what he was talking about: is this picture here of an obese person's brain where the dopamine levels have shrunk so much that this person is probably constantly in survival mode, constantly looking to elevate dopamine levels. And if they know they can get it a certain way, they're going to go back to that over and over and over and over again until they decide that that's not what's getting it for them, and then they'll move to other things. And he said the person that he took this brain scan from uh, went on a diet, started exercising, living a healthier lifestyle, doing all the things that he needed to do to restore those levels, and did it quickly, did a really great job, and it took 3 years. Took 3 years to get that dopamine level back up to um, more normal levels. So let's keep moving along here. We have this tendency in our society to try and understand or try to judge or decide the level of someone's addiction, the intensity of someone's addiction by looking at the severity of their withdrawal. I can't tell you how many times I've seen this. And this is where we start to run into a real problem with adolescents in particular. So I was getting ready to, well, I wasn't getting ready. I was doing an assessment one time. I had a mom bring her teenage son in who had spent the night at the emergency room drinking charcoal and getting his stomach pumped because he'd been at a big party the night before and overdid it. And the party was to celebrate, and this is him explaining this to me. The party was to celebrate his non-addiction. um, and he explained that he had read somewhere that if he could go 2 weeks without having withdrawal symptoms, then he and not using and not have withdrawal symptoms, then he wasn't addicted. And so he took his calendar and he marked off 2 weeks. He'd gotten a little nervous about it because he felt like he was using too much. But he marked off 2 weeks on his calendar. He didn't use for those 2 weeks and he didn't have any withdrawal symptoms. And so to celebrate his non-addiction, they had this big party and he ended up in the ER, almost dead, getting his stomach pumped. So why? What's going on there? And why, if we've got this adolescent who was using heavily, was able to go 2 weeks without withdrawal symptoms? Well, it works differently in adults than it does in adolescents. The adult body is constantly changing chemically. So, whether that's puberty or just the development of the brain, the body is constantly changing chemically. And so for a chemical to rise, to fall, to enter the system, to leave the system is not unusual for a maturing body. And so the body doesn't freak out too much about it. For an adult, however, it's very different. So if an adult has been drinking alcohol, which is a central nervous suppressant, if they've been drinking alcohol for years and they get to that, mid-20s part of their life where they start to, kind of be established in their chemical makeup, and that chemical makeup includes alcohol as the agent that regulates the central nervous system, then to take that away is not only really uncomfortable, but it is actually really dangerous. So to take that away from an adult, you're going to see, risk of heart attack, stroke, seizures, some of those things, because all of a sudden the body's not sure exactly how to regulate the central nervous system. And so they're going to need to be monitored closely by medical professionals. They're going to most likely use medications to reduce the risk of those problems and hopefully get them through that safely. Adolescents don't do that. They don't have that experience. They're not at risk of dying for coming off of alcohol. They're not at risk of and adults aren't really at risk of coming off of opioids either. They wish they could die while they were coming off, but they're not. And even with opioids, the adolescent experience with withdrawals is a tenth of what an adult is going to experience, just in terms of being uncomfortable. And so because of that, they think about substances differently. They experiment and use substances differently. Um, and the addiction process really works for everyone basically the same way. It's over time that we become physiologically dependent on chemicals, but the addiction, that's a dependence. But I'm going to kind of differentiate here and say that the addiction isn't as much it's not a physiological dependence. It's more uh, it's more about this. This is all about our emotional experience. Um, we all experience emotions, and we experience them from one extreme to another, and we navigate back and forth through this emotional continuum here, from extreme sadness to euphoria. But typically, when we experience things like euphoria, we experience them for just a very short period of time. In fact, if you're experiencing it for long periods of time, that's not generally considered healthy, and we may want to talk about some medications. The same is true on the other end for extreme sadness. That shouldn't last for long periods of time. And it should be, all of this should be event related. And so we navigate through this. But let's take an adolescent who gets invited to a party with a bunch of his buddies. He's probably pretty nervous about this whole idea. He knows there's going to be some alcohol there, And, when he gets there, there may even be more than just alcohol, maybe other drugs. And so he's not sure about this, feels a little bit nervous, but kind of excited. He's, being invited into a group of people that, could potentially mean friends and, all of these kind of things. So he gets there and somebody convinces him to go ahead and use something, and he does. The scary part of this whole addiction process, the scariest part of this whole thing is this first use. The reason being is because we've spent a lifetime teaching our kids that if they use drugs, they're going to go to jail, they're going to drop out of school, they're going to lose their family, they're going to have all kinds of health issues, and then eventually they're going to die. And that's not what happens. They go to the party, they use the drug, and they experience euphoria. And they'll never forget that first high. They will work hard. Their brain is constantly chasing that first high. But the problem is I know again, with these drugs having short half-lives and now he's got to go home and you know he's got alcohol in his breath, he's trying to get rid of it, so he's spraying Banaka and he's eating gum and he's all the things that he's been told by his friends that he needs to do so that his parents don't know he was drinking. All of these things going on. He's nervous, in fact, maybe even disappointed. This was a commitment he'd made years ago. He would never do this, and now he's done this. And so he falls down the emotional continuum into the sad part of it, maybe even down into extreme sadness. Now, his brain remembers euphoria. His brain remembers how he got euphoria. And so there's the cycle. So now he's not feeling great. He knows how to feel great. So he starts looking for it, gets invited back to the party again, and then he uses again. But he doesn't hit the first euphoric high again. In fact, he never will hit that first euphoric high they hit on drugs again. And then when it wears off, he comes down again, and this time a little bit lower, and then uses again and gets as high, but not as high. And then when it wears off, he comes down and even lower. And he's moving slowly down to the sad end of the emotional continuum. And I'll tell you, I've heard hundreds of teenagers, young adults that will say, I got to a point where I was using just to feel normal. And so they're no longer getting a high. They're just surviving. They're using drugs, alcohol, whatever it is. And these things, like we saw in that obese brain, I mean, sex, and in fact, we talked about cocaine, 700% of normal. I think some of you are probably on a previous presentation where we talked a little bit about this, but then gaming increases dopamine by 1100%, and pornography increases dopamine by 1700%. That's the highest one we know. And those levels can last as long as the drug is being used. So as long as they're gaming or as long as they're viewing pornography. And in doing that, we are setting our brain up to say, no more. I can't produce anymore. And so those crashes are significant. They are serious. They are scary. They create, this brain screaming, I need dopamine. And we'll try and look and find it anywhere that possibly can. So again, many of you have probably seen this model, but we're not going to go through the whole model. We've got that little piece in our midbrain. So we talked about hindbrain is responsible for survival, midbrain for emotion and memory. In fact, our memories are cataloged by emotion. The forebrain is responsible for rational thought, and its development is significantly delayed. That forebrain isn't really effective or useful, can't really be held accountable until about age 8. I always find that a very interesting number. Anyway, age 8 is when that part of our brain can function enough for accountability. And then it's not fully developed until mid to late 20s. Yes, women reach full development almost always before men do. We are a lot slower. We're so proud of our logic and reason, us men, that you'd think that we were the ones getting there first, but actually we're not. In fact, that forebrain works better um, when, and many of you have heard the term wise mind, but when we can combine rational thought with our heart, we're fairly advanced at that point. And so, and we can't access our heart generally without that forebrain. But when our brain goes into survival mode, it takes forebrain offline. Forebrain doesn't want anything getting in the way of survival. The amygdala is always looking for a threat. It doesn't distinguish or discriminate between threats. Doesn't care if it's a big threat or little threat, perceived threat, real threat, internal threat, external threat. It doesn't discriminate. All threats are equal to the amygdala, and typically, because it's a threat, all of the messages from the amygdala are going to go first to the hindbrain, um, basically saying, "Save me." Let's stay safe, and so it takes the forebrain offline so it doesn't get in the way. And so if you think about an adolescent whose forebrain isn't fully developed, because we're seeing that into the mid late 20s. In fact, research right now is showing us that a lot of times that forebrain isn't fully developed now until early 30s, which is a result of not using it, basically. We don't have to problem solve. We don't have to reason through things like we used to. We can just Google it or YouTube it or, ask Siri or Alexa to help us figure these things out. Now we've got AI, which is just up the ante in ways that, in fact, I was working on a little project a week or so ago, and I found myself, after using AI several times on several pieces of what I was writing, that the creative part of my brain shut off. I stopped being able to think about where I was going and what I was doing with this project, and scared me, scared me to death. My brain immediately thought, well, type prompts into AI. Just go ahead, chat GPT this thing. And so we're seeing a delay in the development of that forebrain. But if you take adolescents who already, you know, naturally don't have a fully developed rational part of their brain. So a lot of their decisions are made emotionally. They're impulsive decisions. The forebrain is kind of the stop center of the brain, where the midbrain is kind of the go center of the brain. Anything sounds good. It all sounds fun. I'm ready to do it all, is what the midbrain says, where the forebrain says, now, wait a minute, what are the consequences going to be here? If we get that forebrain offline constantly or consistently, then there's no regulation going on, and so we typically have to step in and lend our forebrain to those who are without. So let's kind of slide here for just a second over into what are we looking for then? What do we need to be paying attention to? Behavioral signs. And I think most of you probably know this, but I think our society has moved to a place where adults have gotten a little bit nervous when it comes to challenging adolescents, when it comes to questioning or what might look like accusing adolescents, because they've been given a lot of power and authority in our society right now that they're not capable of managing very well. And it gets difficult. We feel like we have to kind of walk on eggshells and be careful. And I think for parents and for those of you who are working with parents and working with or have the opportunity to work with parents, that we need to encourage parents far more often to get in there and look, go ahead and challenge, go ahead and push. Um, Otherwise, we're going to have to live with the consequences of not having looked, not having pushed. And in some cases, that consequence is losing a child. And so, um, and the other thing about, looking for these signs and symptoms of substance abuse is if we're seeing these signs, it may not always 100% mean that they're using drugs or alcohol. It could mean that they're having other issues, which is just as important. We still have to address that. We still want to address that. And the more we can be aware, the more that our kids can be aware of what these, behaviors mean, what some of these feelings mean. We talk about awareness being the miracle moment. When we become aware, we have agency. When we become aware, we can make choices. We can do things about whatever's going on. We're not going to do anything about something we're not aware of. So awareness is the miracle moment. That's when we have agency. And so I think as parents, as counselors, as therapists, as clergy, as first responders, coaches, all these people where we're engaged in the community, and in many, many, many cases we're engaged with kids. um, God, don't hesitate to ask questions. We've all learned in the QPR training that the most important thing we can do, one of the most important things we can do when we're concerned about somebody who might be suicidal, is to ask them and ask them straight up. We're not beating around the bush. We're not using, careful language. We're asking them straight up. Have you thought about killing yourself? We've learned over time that us bringing it up doesn't give them the idea. If they had the idea, they already had the idea. If they're going to have it, they're going to have it. We're not going to be the ones that create that, and we just need to ask. And the same goes with all of this stuff. Have frank, straightforward, honest conversations. I had a boss one time years ago that said, I can deal with bad news. I can't deal with bad information. And so if we can somehow build our relationships on a principle like that, where, we're having honest, open conversation, even if it's bad news, even if it's uncomfortable information, we're still having the conversations because it's good information. And we make better decisions when we have good information. So let's push, the agenda here. Let's start having better conversations. That kid that went to the party and has been taught that he's going to go to jail and ultimately die because he uses drugs. Well, I mean, that can be true, but typically that's a ways down the road. And when he's sitting there feeling euphoric, and he's got a new group of friends, and he's accepted. I had a guy I worked with a long, long time ago. He says, "Yeah, the beauty of substance abuse is that I can be included in the group, and all I have to know how to do is flick a bic." So here he is in that setting, and all of us adults just became liars, and they literally have to question whether or not the information we're giving them is really accurate, because we didn't tell them anything about the fact that the drug was going to work. We didn't tell them how good it was going to feel. We didn't tell them about the reasons why people, even though they may be experiencing those consequences, all the negative stuff, they still use. Well, they still use because it works. It is effective in numbing our emotional experience. It gives us the opportunity or the feeling of control over our emotional experience, which is, in many cases, just as addictive as the chemicals themselves. The ability to control my emotional experience. And again, that's where we go back to how many things can we do that with? When I'm walking out of the grocery store with $35 worth of sweet and salty, guess what I'm doing? And then I'm headed home, for the couch and the remote. I don't want to deal. I don't want to talk. I don't want to process. I don't want to deal with how I'm feeling. And so I can change that. I can numb that. Now, unfortunately, of course, we all understand that means that it doesn't go away, or it doesn't mean that it goes away. It hangs around, and I've got to deal with it at some point. I've got to process it. So, decline in academic performance and changes in friend groups. We start seeing them be secretive in their behaviors. When we start to see significant mood swings or irritability, and again, they may be experiencing that just being a teenager and some of the chemical changes they're going through. But ask, talk, what's going on. If we don't have that kind of relationship, if there's not a place where they can talk, we may never know. Changes in sleep patterns, loss of interest in hobbies, activities, and of course, if they get involved legally, then we need to pay close attention. I always tell parents it's the rule of five. If they tell you they've used once, they've used five times. Take whatever they tell you and multiply it by five, and then you're going to be closer to what's really going on. The rule of five. Physical signs. Yeah, be looking for it. Bloodshot eyes, dilated pupils. You can smell alcohol. You can smell smoke. You can smell marijuana. Um, Frequent nosebleeds. Yeah, that one might be, maybe up into some of the adult range. But I think neglecting personal hygiene, when all of a sudden you see somebody who worked to really take care of themselves, um, you know, and at risk of sounding judgmental, but dressed nice, um, looked like they had good hygiene habits and things like that. Now are uh, getting kind of grungy and dirty and body odor, and these are red flags, even if it's not substance abuse. And then significant weight changes, up or down. We need to pay attention to those things. The psychological signs, when we see that and in a lot of cases, so a change in anxiety or paranoia, again, that could be very normal for adolescents. However, if it comes on quickly, if it comes on suddenly, that's significant. Depression, withdrawal. Addiction is a disease of isolation, period. Addiction is a disease of isolation. And recovery is not about not using. Okay, I'll say it again. Recovery is not about not using. Recovery from addiction is not about not using. It's about living. And so when we start to see the elements of living disappear, when we start to see them withdraw from living, then we need to be very concerned, and we need to interject ourselves into that and be thinking intervention. And guilt and denial, if they're looking guilty all the time and they're just waiting for you to come down on them, and you don't know why, there's not a really good reason, um, then there is a reason. They're thinking about it all the time. It's a story that's running and running and running and running in their head. And so again, have that conversation. And then again, somebody who's been able to stay focused on tasks now all of a sudden can't stay focused on tasks. Could be, ADHD, but again, it's worth asking. Physical evidence, and here's again, it's interesting to me how many times I've worked with parents who are afraid to search their kid's room. They have suspicions. In fact, sometimes they'll tell me what their suspicions are, and they're more than suspicions. It's almost like empirical evidence that their kid is using, but they're afraid to search their room because, oh, that's their space. No, it's not. We adults are responsible for these young people in making sure that they're safe. They don't have the resources it takes to make good, logical decisions to keep themselves safe. we have to step in. We have to intervene. And if that means that as a parent or, as a counselor, I'm talking to a parent saying, you need to go home and search your child's room and start looking for things like paraphernalia. Is there, do all of a sudden, they have lots of extra money? They coming home with new clothes, new shoes, new, sports equipment, and saying you're not sure where they're getting this stuff. Pay attention to those things because it can be related to drug use. And then, of course, risk-taking, reckless behavior, sometimes hard to delineate, is that adolescence or is that drug use? But when it starts to look extreme, again, we've got to pay attention. So driving under the influence, engaging in dangerous activities, um, and then unexplained injuries. They're not going to tell you about their injuries because they don't want to be found out. So what can we do? Again, over and over and over. Keep talking about open communication. And I'm telling you right now that open communication doesn't happen in the moment that you need it. Open communication happens at the dinner table when nothing's going on. We practice open communication. We create it as a part of the culture, either in the classroom, in that office, in our home. It's the culture. We have to develop the culture, and we do that by practicing these good things like talking and being open. And as adults, we need to set the example. So not only am I going to talk to you about my day, but I'm going to include emotion words. I'm going to tell you how I felt today. I'm going to tell you about things that I've struggled with. Working with a middle-aged gentleman right now who his biggest struggle is that he has always felt like his parents were perfect and that there's no way they can understand him because they've never struggled. They've never had anything difficult go on in their life. And so as he's kind of getting his feet under him right now and having some interesting conversations with his parents are like, oh no, no, we had all kinds of challenges, and I struggle, with this behavior and this thought process, and these kind of things. And this gentleman says to his dad, "How was I ever supposed to know that? You never talked about it. You never said a thing." One of the most important things we can do is help our kids understand that they are human, that we are human, and that together we're working through all of this. So let's keep track of changes that are going on. If there needs to be some journaling and you keep track that way, then let's do that. And then involve professionals where you need it. And that goes for us professionals. When it starts to be something that might be just a little outside of our expertise or our scope of practice, um, call someone, get some help. Have somebody talk through it with you. Um, I'm happy to get on the phone with anybody. In fact, the last slide here, I'll have my cell phone number and my email address. Reach out. I'm happy to brainstorm or talk through anything with you. And then engage in support systems. Really, one of the biggest solutions to all of the challenges that we see particularly with substance abuse and a lot of the mental health stuff going on, is engaging in community. It's connections, relationships. We need oxytocin. We need the places and ability to process emotion. And the best way to do that is to talk and be able to share that with others. And we've got to have relationships to do that. And so anyway, I think we are there. Thank you, you guys. Really appreciate being able to spend this last hour with you. We're right up to 5 minutes before the hour, so I promised I would leave a few minutes for questions. Are there some?
Ben, the first one is, how do Suboxone and methadone affect children?
Um, I don't have really probably all the research on that and want to be a little bit careful about what I say. I do know, though, that I have worked with young adults um, who've come into treatment programs on either one of those, methadone or Suboxone, and they have been frustrated at the fact that they feel as addicted to those chemicals as they felt like they were to the opioids that they were trying to get off of. And maybe part of that was, I'm just thinking of one in particular that I know wasn't receiving any counseling. He was just showing up at the clinic and getting dosed, and then that was it. And so it was a fairly irresponsible use of medication assisted treatment. But um, I would be very, very careful about using those with adolescents. Again, the reason for using those is to keep someone from relapsing. It's to help them not relapse because the relapse symptoms are so horrible that they would rather use than go through those. And so if the methadone or Suboxone can kind of taper that and cut that back and keep them engaged in the recovery process, that's the purpose of it. And so with adolescents, we don't really need to use methadone or Suboxone with adolescents because they're not experiencing the intensity of the withdrawal symptoms that adults do.
Awesome. Okay, number 2, you speak of different forms of addiction, including porn. What does electronic addiction do to the brain? Is there similarities?
Absolutely. It works almost exactly the same. Now, I will tell you with pornography, there is a process that the brain goes through. In fact, interestingly enough, that fully nude pornography is actually a little less impactful on the brain than partially nude. So, you would think, yeah, I'm going to let my son have the swimsuit issue of Sports Illustrated over Playboy because at least they have a swimsuit on. Well, not necessarily, because the brain engages in the process of finishing the story. So the brain is going to continue to disrobe, that individual, and also in that process, the disconnection with people, and this happens also with gaming. The worst games in terms of really high dopamine levels are role play games. So Call of Duty, first person shooter games, Grand Theft Auto, World of Warcraft, those kinds of games where you're role playing, it puts you in a position to objectify the other people you're interacting with because they're not people. They're images. They're with pornography, it's not an actual person. So there's no real accountability. There's no real connection. It's just pure dopamine. There's no oxytocin in this. And so we want to be careful about that because yes, there can actually be some additional issues. The objectifying of people has us have a tendency to disconnect from people a lot quicker and more significantly.
Hmm. All right, number 3. At Primary Children's, we are seeing a big increase in substance use-induced psychosis. Is this a result of using more of the type of substance they are is this a result of using more or the type of substance they are using? So is it more of the substance or the type?
I would say yes.
The both?
So, but I would say that the psychosis probably would link maybe more back to the type of drug being used because, again, adolescents have a tendency to be able to process and flush those drugs out of their system a lot faster than adults do, so that they don't typically have those issues. Um, they're going to have those issues when the intensity or the level of the psychoactive chemical in the drug is so high that they can't process it fast enough to get away from having some of those consequences.
Makes sense. Okay, we did have one more come in, so this is our last one. Lately, we've seen suicide skyrocket. 6 of my son's friends have completed suicide. In your experience when committing them to safety, is there anything in addition to improve their safety? So
Wow.
this is actually more suicide based.
Um, yeah, that one's a tough one. And, uh, and sounds like if it's 6 of his friends, there's that contagion element that's playing a role there too, which is very, very scary. And I think that, I don't know that there's anything bigger or better than just the communication. And, if they're not communicating with you, then involve others and professionals, get them in to see someone. Um, yeah, that's not my specialty area. And I know that, you can go through lots of things like get the guns out of your house and, lock up your pills and, do all kinds of stuff like that. If they're hell bent on doing it, they'll find other places and other ways and other means. But the important questions are things like, are you thinking about hurting yourself? And if so, how? And if they have a plan, then your next question is, do they have the means? So if they're talking about overdosing on some pills, do you know where you would get those pills? Do you already have those pills? If they're talking about using a gun, do you know where you would get that gun, or do you already have that gun? And if they are thinking about hurting themselves and they have a plan and they have the means, then they need professional intervention at that point, period.
Thank you, Ben. That's all I have.
Great. Did anyone have any other questions for Ben before we end today? I know we're a little over, but I want to make sure that everyone gets any questions answered that they might have.
I hope it was helpful.
I know,
Barry.
yeah, we've got a lot of thank yous going on in the chat.
That was
I
a that was a
I
lot of
echo.
information, and you guys got it real fast.
We appreciate your time, Ben.
No, of course. I love spending time with all of you.
Fantastic. And don't forget, this is a two-part CE. So if you would like to attend the second part, um, Arden is going to be taking over that second part. That will conclude on the 25th of February. That's a Tuesday. So mark your calendar if you want the second part. And I'm sure it's going to be just as exciting and educational as this hour was. So if you want to mark your calendar, that's something to look forward to as well. And that is virtual. So you can just log in just like we did today and catch the second half of that. Yeah, Luann said that so helpful for her as a grandmother. She works professionally with adults with dementia, and she's very grateful for this information.
Awesome. Awesome. Yes, us grandparents, we're influencers too. We have the opportunity to definitely impact the lives of those that we love.
Thank you again, Ben. Thank you, Kristen, for your help today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. This has been a very educational hour.